guys, a couple of things before we get started. Just a reminder, this Friday we do have an open lab, so you'll have 2 open lab opportunities before your next exam. If you want to take advantage of those, 8:30 to 10. So I cannot get there as early as 8 on either of those days. So 8:30 to 10 this Friday and on October 12th. So if you want to go ahead and write those down, you can. Just a reminder, it is an opportunity to ask lecture questions as well. I can tell you my office has been pretty empty during office hours. And after grading about 3/4 of the exams, some of you need to be using office hours. So if you are having a hard time or if you're not understanding something, either find me during lab, if you have my lab, come to open lab, come to office hours, utilize those opportunities to talk to me or to ask Professor Ballesteros questions. I have not seen the lab grades yet from Professor Ballesteros' class, but I know from mine, lab grades look like they're going to be a lot higher than lecture grades. So you need to think about how you're spending your time and making certain that you're utilizing all of the opportunities that you have to learn the information. Okay? We are starting a new unit. So this unit is the skeletal system. And just to give you a little information about what to expect. The good news is it's one system. It's all about bones. This entire section is all about bones. So in some ways that makes it easier because that first unit, you have a lot of pieces of information that aren't always easy to connect. Right? This unit, it's all about bones. So that makes it a little bit more straightforward in some ways. The bad news is there's a ton of memorization, both in lab and in lecture. In lab, you've already started, so you're aware that you've got these long lists of bone structures to identify. So it's difficult vocabulary, difficult spelling, so that takes time. In lecture, not only do you have to learn bone formation, bone repair, all of that part of it, but at the very end, you're going to learn joints. You'll be tested on the joints in lecture. Even though you'll be learning some of it in lab, you'll be tested on it in lecture. And that's a ton of memorization also. Because you're going to have to know which 2 bony parts come together. What's the name of that joint? What kind of movements occur at that joint? It's a lot to memorize. And the reason I'm telling you this is because if you wait till the very end to try to study, it's impossible. It's physically impossible to remember all of that. So stay on top of the material, study after every class, and then you'll give yourself enough time there at the end to learn the joints that you need to learn. All right, so as we start talking about the skeletal system, well, we want to first talk about our functions of the organ system as a whole. So when we look at the function of the bones or the function of the skeletal system, the first few are the most straightforward. So the first, support. We're aware at this point that our skeleton, our bones, act as the scaffold for the body. They're what provide the shape to the body. They are what allow us to stand upright and to hold our body in a certain position. So they're a support structure, a scaffold for the body. Without bones, we would be a pile of goo. There's not a lot else in the body that gives us structural support. The second bullet point up here, the second function of bones, protection. Bones are hard. So we already know by looking at body cavities that the bones are oftentimes the walls of the body cavities. So when you learned the cranial cavity, that was the skull bones encasing and protecting the brain. We saw the same thing with the vertebral cavity. But there you had the vertebrae, the bone, protecting the spinal cord. Look at your rib cage. Here you've got your thoracic cage wrapping around and protecting the heart and lungs. Same thing down here, pelvis. The pelvis, again, helping to protect and wrap around reproductive organs. So we're looking at bony support and bony protection. The third one, movement. Movement comes in the form of that your muscles attach to your bones. So when we talk about joints, where 2 bones come together, and the movements that can occur between those 2 bones, the movement that can occur, for instance, at my elbow, the only way that movement is going to happen is if a muscle yanks on the bone and repositions it. So your bones act as lever systems in the body. This is why it helps to know a little bit about physics in order to understand physiology. It's one of the reasons that it helps. Because your bones are just a bunch of levers. And the muscles are used to reposition the bones, allowing us to move around through space. The fourth one. Bones are a site for mineral storage. Which mineral? Calcium is the main mineral that we're going to be talking about. So the calcium gets deposited into the bone tissue. It's stored there. Now it's stored there. That doesn't mean that it is stuck there and it stays there forever. We're constantly putting new calcium into bone and taking calcium out of bone. Bone is like a bank for storage. You can add calcium, you can take calcium away. And so you constantly have this mineral deposition, putting it into the bone, as well as taking the mineral out of bone and reabsorbing it back into the blood, where it could be used somewhere else. So this idea of utilizing minerals by taking it in and out of bone. The fifth one, hematopoiesis. When you see heme, what does that tell you? Blood, right? Hemoglobin. Blood, heme. So hematopoiesis, blood cell production. Hematopoiesis is blood cell production. Now when I say blood cell production, I'm not being specific there. Right? We have different types of blood cells. So blood cell production would include your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. Now, obviously, I'm not going to teach you blood right now, but at this point, I do want you to have an understanding of the basic function of these different parts of your blood. So what do red blood cells do for us? Oxygen. Remember, those are the ones that had hemoglobin inside of them, and the hemoglobin could transport the oxygen. So red blood cells are used for oxygen transport. That's their job. White blood cells. These are immune cells. So these are used to fight infections. What about platelets? Good, blood clotting. This is what prevents us from bleeding out every time we get a little cut on our finger. So all of these different parts of the blood are all made through the process of hematopoiesis, producing new blood cells. And we constantly are making new blood cells. Now, hematopoiesis, I'm putting up there as a function that happens as part of the skeletal system. And it happens inside of your bones. It happens within red bone marrow. That is the site for hematopoiesis. And as we move forward today, what we're going to find is that there are spaces inside of our bones. And those spaces in certain locations are filled with red bone marrow. So there's certain areas, certain cavities that are hollowed out inside of the bone that allow us to store red bone marrow inside the bone. And within that, you can then make blood cells. So hematopoiesis. And the last one that's up there, triglyceride storage. What are triglycerides? Fats. Well, also inside of other spaces in the bone, we have what's called yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow is basically fat tissue. So we can store fats in some of those spaces inside the bones. That would be stored as yellow bone marrow. Why? Why would I want to store some fat? What could I use it for? Energy. Energy. So if there is a high demand on the body, we could tap into these energy stores. Do you think we tap into them regularly? No, right? These are hidden deep inside the bones. So they're not going to be a quick and easy source of energy. But if I'm starving, truly starving, I don't mean at the end of class you're hungry, right? I mean you're starving and you need additional energy supplies, this would be one we could tap into. Okay? So it's a reservoir for extra energy that you would only tap into if you had a really high demand for ATP that couldn't be met in normal mechanisms. So triglyceride storage happens in the form of yellow bone marrow, again, that would be housed inside these spaces inside the bones. So as we start looking at the skeleton, the skeleton as a whole can be divided into two major groups of bones. We have the axial skeleton, and on the next picture, it's what's shown in brown, versus the appendicular skeleton, which in the next picture will be shown as the yellow bones. Let me define them both for you first, and then I'll show you the picture. So when you look at the axial skeleton, it's basically the trunk region of the body, the core of the body. So it's going to include your skull, your vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. Let's write that down. So for the axial skeleton, it's the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. By thoracic cage, you're looking at the bones that go around the thorax. So it would be your ribs and your sternum, as well as the thoracic vertebrae in the back. So making a cage around the thorax. And you'll learn all of those in lab. That's the axial skeleton. That's it. Leaving everything else as part of the appendicular skeleton. So appendicular would include what? The limbs. Okay, so the limbs, meaning your arms and your legs, as well as their points of attachment. The limbs and their point of attachment, their girdle that they're going to sit in. So for instance, if you're looking at the arm has a shoulder girdle that it sits in. Your scapula and your clavicle. That's what it attaches to. So it includes both the arm and the bones that it attaches to. Your leg and the pelvis, because that's what it attaches to. That would be the appendicular skeleton.
Why is it brown and yellow in parentheses?
Oh, because that's going to be on the next picture.
Oh, okay.
So it's going to be as it's indicated on the next picture.
Oh, okay.
So again, appendicular skeleton, the limbs, and the bones that they anchor to. So if I look here, it doesn't show up quite as brown and yellow on this picture, but this middle part right here, shown as the darker color, that's the axial skeleton. Skull, vertebral column, thoracic cage, axial skeleton. Appendicular skeleton, shown in the lighter color, the upper limb here, the arm bones, as well as the bones that it attaches here to at the shoulder. The leg bones, as well as the bone that it attaches to here at the hip, at the pelvic girdle. Appendicular skeleton. We can further then subdivide the bones by the shape of the bone. So we can classify what type of bone it is by its appearance. And this is what you can see with your naked eye. I'm not talking about microscopic appearance. I'm talking about describing the shape of the bone. And there's 4 options, and they're pretty straightforward. If I'm looking at a long bone, basically the height is greater than the width. It's long. It's a long bone. The height is greater than the width.